Hello, so it's Michael here, and today I'm doing part 6 of the dialogue system. Now, I know for some of you, you've probably been waiting for this for quite a while, but today we're going to be going over setting up a save system. Essentially setting it up so that you can save the dialogue progress from the dialogue component. So you can essentially store individual options that the player's chosen, so when they jump back in, those same options are the same, so they're not having to go through the same sort of options that they've already clicked on, because obviously that might lead to other things getting triggered that you might not want to if they've already had it happen already. So just before we do that though, I do however want to just address a few things within the system already, some tweaks if you were, that should hopefully just prevent some bugs that sort of crop up from time to time. So let's jump into it. So I am currently in the dialogue tutorial project. Now, just so you are aware, this is the same project that I created the interaction system in, as well as the various doors which you can find tutorials for on my channel. So just so you are, that's kind of where all this stuff sort of comes from. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go ahead and jump into the dialogue base. Now the dialogue base is sort of the main dialogue component that you add to your various NPCs. And what we want to do is actually go to the open conversation function. Now, I'm going to give you a quick explanation of the bug. And this is kind of where, depending on how it is you're triggering these conversations, or these dialogues, sometimes it can kind of result in duplicate dialogue widgets that sort of get shown up on the screen. And this can kind of cause an issue because you then end up left with a widget on the screen that you can't do anything with. It doesn't matter how many times you click the buttons or anything like that, it's just it stays on the screen. Now, if you're using the interaction system that I show in my other tutorials, this generally wouldn't be too much of an issue because we kind of already handle that within the interaction system to make sure that this only ever gets called once. But sometimes, if depending on what you're doing, that might not be something that you want, but you still want to make sure that you're only ever opening one dialogue conversation at a time. So to do this, it's quite simple, straightforward. In the open conversation, what we want to do is drag in a reference to the dialogue widget that we have up here, and we just want to right click on it and convert that to a validated get. I want to connect that at the beginning, like so, and then we want to go ahead and just connect the is not valid to the create dialogue widget. So what that's going to do is, if it comes through here and it's already got a dialogue widget which gets set here, so we create it and then set it. So if it's already has one, then it'll do nothing essentially because we don't want it to do anything. So that'll kind of stop it from being essentially double created, which we don't want. But it does then lead to another thing we have to address. So in terms of the dialogue widget itself, whilst we do remove it from the viewport when we close the dialogue, so if we go to the close conversation, we do remove it from the viewport. But we do now also need to make sure we're also setting that dialogue widget variable to null. So we're essentially removing that reference to that specific instance of that widget. Like so. So in terms of the specifics on this, so as I said, there's those two nodes, and that'll just prevent the dialogue widget from being created multiple times and help prevent the overlapping widgets that we sometimes get. Time to move on to the meat of the tutorial, if you were. So what we want to do is save the progress. So for example, if we was to go to the mouse's dialogue that we have up on the hill, there's a few different things that kind of happen as we go through that kind of result in different sort of sections, as it were. We have the dialogue branch, so this kind of controls what ends up sort of the overall flow of the dialogue. So once we've given mouse some cheese, it'll then go to this particular section, which kind of helps prevent it having to traverse all the other dialogue that we no longer ever need, because we've dealt with all that. We don't need to do it again. But obviously we do need to make sure we save some of these variables. So the main ones we want to actually save is dialogue progress and the active dialogue branch and the branch progress. So it's these three variables, which are the main ones that are used, that we kind of need to save and then reinitialize when we load our game. So what we can do is we can go ahead and start creating a save game object. Now, if you've not used saved game objects before, you can kind of think of it as a special object that you can create variables in, and then when you set those variables to certain values, you call the save game to slot function. What it does is it essentially serializes all that data, so converts it all to a string and some other things, and then creates a file on the physical computer, gives it a name, and then saves it. And when you're loading a save game object, so loading from disk as it were, it kind of does the opposite. So it finds that file, loads it all up, creates the save game object, and then populates the variables with the serialized data. So it kind of does like a lot of heavy lifting. If you used to use different software or used to try and create your own game engine, for example, you'd kind of have to handle all that yourself. Okay, so what we want to do is in the content browser, just come to right click on empty space, and then you want to click on blueprint class, and then you want to click the little drop down that says all classes, and you want to search for save game. So with save game selected, you can then click the select button at the bottom, and that'll create a new save game object. So we'll give that a name, and we'll call this one, just going to call it SGO dialog. Right, so, and if we open that up, you'll notice there's no functions we can override. In terms of events, there isn't any. You can create some custom ones. But the save game object, it's very bare bones. It's literally there to put data into to save to disk. So that's the whole purpose of it. What we need to do at this particular point is actually decide how it is we want to structure our data. Now this can vary depending on the certain projects you're working on, and even down to the individual systems you might be developing. But the main sort of two choices that we have at this particular point is how it is we want to handle the specific dialog data here. So dialog progress, the dialog branch, and the branch progress. Do we want to save this as a per instance of each NPC or dialog component, or do we want to collate all that into a single save game object where it all gets loaded at once? There are of course pros and cons to both of them. So if we were to separate it all out into so each component gets its own save game object, this can be quite beneficial, particularly if there's quite a lot of data. This can help just improve some of those load times a little bit, and it can help prevent you loading data that isn't currently needed at that specific time. So having it on a per instance basis can be quite handy if you're doing things like level streaming, where some of your NPCs might not always be loaded at the same time and things like that. Similarly, if you've got bosses or other NPCs that might not appear until later on, and then when they do appear, they might not really show up much anymore. So you can kind of get a bit more flexibility from that sort of standpoint. If, however, you have quite a lot of NPCs and they're all going to be present, then you might want to collate all that data so it all gets loaded together. This can be quite handy because again, it keeps everything all in one place, but there are some additional steps you kind of have to go through to sort of facilitate that. What I'm going to show in this particular episode is going down the route of having it where each component is separate. And the reason why is because I think specifically for dialogue, especially if you start leaning into the idea of NPCs having their own sets of data as well. So in that way you can kind of have a save game object per NPC that can include things like the location, if you've got the move in, any stats that they might have, obviously you've got the dialogue as well. And keeping it all separate can make things a little bit easier to manage in the long run. So I think hopefully it'll be a little bit more useful to everyone as a general approach. Obviously what method you want to use can vary depending on the sort of project you're making. Okay, so I've kind of talked a little bit long on there in terms of what it is that we're planning to do. So now let's do it. So because we are going for a single save game object per dialog component, how we want to set up the save game object is a little bit simpler. So what I'm actually going to do is in the dialog base, we're just going to right click on the dialog progress and just copy it. And then in the save game object, we can right click on the variables and we can just paste that variable. And that's just going to create an exact copy with exactly the same name in there for us. We want to do that the same thing for the active dialog branch and the branch progress. So just as a reminder, the branch progress is set up so if we're switching to a different branch, it stores the dialog progress for that specific branch. So if we switch back to it, we've still got that particular progress if we need it. Okay, so I'm just going to move the dialog branch up one just so it's a bit more of a logical order as to what we might need. I guess we could technically probably do that as well. Okay, so now we've got those variables in there, we kind of want to set up some things in here to decide when this gets created, loaded, and all that lovely stuff. So for me, we're going to go ahead and do it on begin play. So we're in the dialog base, and I'm just going to move the event begin play up, move this over a little bit, and I'm actually going to create a sequence here. And that's just so I can come down. Sequence just executes in order, so it'll be the equivalent of sticking it on the end. And we want to put something here that controls the loading of our data if it is present. So we're going to create a function in here, and we'll call this one load dialog data. There we go. And then we'll just drop that in to the then one. Like so. Okay, so now we've got the load dialog data function, we can start populating some things in there. So the first thing we generally want to do is we want to check does save game exist? So this is the name of the function, and what we do is we specify a slot name, and it will return whether or not that slot exists. Like so we'll just kind of connect it there. Now what we've got to do is we kind of have to contend with the slot name. So what does it mean by slot name? And simply put, it's the directory. So it's the file. So what we can actually do to hopefully get the message across a little bit, I'm just going to come to the content browser. I'm just going to right click on a file. It doesn't matter specifically. And we're just going to click Show in Explorer. And what this is going to do is open up the Windows Explorer. And this is where all your files and things are located. And if we go to the root of the project, so in this case I've got Dialog Tutorial 5.5, and that's just because I've recently updated to 5.5 in this particular project. But if we go to the root folder, we have then a folder called Saved. If we open up that, there is then another folder called Save Games, which we don't currently have in here. So when we're looking at slot names, it's essentially the folders and file names in that specific folder. So hopefully that'll make a bit more sense when we actually create a file, well, a save object, because it'll create the folder and it'll show up in here. So we'll jump back to this later, and hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense. So the next kind of question we've got to kind of ask ourselves is how is it we want to actually structure the files for the save files, essentially. And what I mean by that is, do we want it to put the files in a specific folder name to make them easy to locate, or do we not care and we just want to dump it all in the same folder with all the other safe stuff? It's kind of up to you how it is you want to sort of manage that. A few caveats you kind of have to remember though is depending on the platform that you're targeting, there may be character limits on the overall file path. I believe things like consoles, I think they tend to have a shorter one. I've not worked with them specifically, so I can't confirm 100%, but it is just things I've heard from other people that have worked on console-specific platforms, that there are character limits. So it is just something to be aware of. It's not something you tend to have as much of a problem with if you're just doing Windows. So trying to keep them short can be quite helpful. But even having said that, if you have ways of dynamically changing them, then you could always make them shorter at a later date if you wanted to. But you just have to remember that if you do change the slot names, that could potentially break any future any older saves, because the game wouldn't then be able to find them. Now, I'm going to go for something where it's going to create a folder called dialogue, and then it's going to essentially put every single save game object that it creates in that dialogue folder. The way we kind of denote that is by using a backslash. So if I was to do dialogue backslash, backslash like so, and then just like the NPC name, so mouse, for example, it would create a folder called dialogue. If it already exists, then it'll just skip that step, and then it will create the actual file name mouse. So that way you can kind of easily identify which save object is for which. Now, the thing is, because the dialogue component itself is going to be used on different NPCs, we do kind of need a bit more of a dynamic way to be able to define what this is. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a function for doing that. So we'll call get slot name. Actually, we'll do that as get save slot name, and we want this to return a string. So we're going to add a return node, and then on the outputs we're going to add a string in output. I'm just going to call this one slot, like so. Now for me, I'm going to also add another variable to the dialog base. I'm going to call this one NPC name. If you already have something set up for your NPC name, so I don't think we do actually have something. 1 second. So what I was kind of thinking, if you already have something set up with their name, then you may want to just kind of pull that instead. I don't think we have anything specific other than just manually setting it in here. Is that even still used? Actually, is it still used? Oh no, so it is still used. My apologies there. The character name. Okay, so it is in the base. So we do have something there. Okay, yeah. So what I will do then, this will only be applicable if you're using the NPC base that we have set up here. Again, you probably have something similar set up potentially. So going back to the dialog base, we're just going to remove the NPC name. And instead what we're going to do is get the owner. So this is the thing that the act component is placed upon. So then we'll do that and we'll cast to the NPC base. Like so. If the cast fails and it's not an NPC base, we could always do something else if we wanted to. But in this case, I'm just going to return an empty slot for now. Again, we could always come back in and modify that if we wanted to. And from here, we can get the name, so the character name. Now, this name is a text, so it is a user-facing name. So first, I am going to go ahead and convert that to a string. Now, with the character name, chances are there could potentially be some spaces in there. Now, when we're dealing with sort of file names and things like that, we generally want to make sure we are avoiding special characters. So for this, I don't believe there's a restricted now. Yeah, I don't think there's anything specific for removing restricted characters. But what we can always do is go through and do some replacing. So I'm just going to replace any spaces. So there is a space in there on the from. I'm just going to replace that with an underscore. So it's just something to be aware of. That's it. And because that is a string, I'm then going to come in and do an append. And I want to just append dialogue backslash. And actually, I'm going to just convert all this to lowercase as well before I pop that in. This just helps keep the naming conventions consistent. You can obviously modify this to however you like. You know, again, it's your project, you can do what you want. So in terms of what we've done here, this is going to get the character name from the NPC base. Again, if you have a name somewhere else, you can just get it from there. Alternatively, you could just set one up inside the dialogue base and use that instead. It's completely up to you. But once we've got that, we go through and remove any spaces. We just convert those to underscores. We convert it all to lowercase, and then we append, well, I guess this is a prefix, the dialogue underscore, dialogue backslash, yes, to the front of that, and then we return that as the slot. Okay, so now we've done that, we can go ahead and get the slot name, save slot, and drag it in. So it is a normal function, so we do want to convert that to a pure function. So with it selected, you should be able to convert it to a pure just on the details panel. And then we can connect that to the slot name, like so. Now, the reason why we've done this as a function is because we actually have another step we then need to do that will also require the slot name. So having a consistent way of being able to get it and dynamically change it is kind of vital, because if the slot names vary at any of these stages, it's all going to fall apart. It's not going to function the way that you want it to. So once we've done the first check, which is does save game exist, we then want to load load game from slot. So does save game exist? So if that's true, we want to get the save slot name again, and this time we actually want to load it. So when we actually load it, this is where it creates a save game object. It reads all the data from the file on the disk and kind of like pops that into the save game object that it creates. So that's the thing here that it returns. Now in this instance, we know what sort of save game it's going to be, so I'm going to go ahead and cast to that. So this is going to be our dialogue, the SGO dialogue. And at that particular point, I am then going to promote that to a variable. Right, so, and that's going to store the save game object as a reference. Right, so now in terms of does save game exist, and the answer is false, we kind of have a few options in terms of what we can do here as well. Do we want it where it will automatically create one if one doesn't exist, and then kind of just go from there? Or do we want it just to not bother and we'll create it later if we need it? Of course, pros and cons to both of those. Personally, I like to just go down the route of just creating the save game object, and so that way it's ready, available for when we actually want to save. So for that, what we're going to do is create save game object, and we want to choose the save game, so in this case the SGO dialog, like so. Now because we've specified a specific class type here, we don't need to cast. This is already going to be the type that we want, so we can just get a copy of the save data set variable node and we can paste that in like so. Right, so at this particular point, all we've done is we've just checked, does a particular file name exist that we expect? If it does, great, go ahead and load it and extract the data from it. If it doesn't exist, create a file that we would normally extract the data into, but obviously at this point it would be empty. So at this particular point, we've loaded the data, so that's kind of like step 1, I guess. I know there's technically a few things we've done here, but we can say, yeah, we've loaded the data, but we also then need to apply that data. So just because we've loaded it doesn't mean we've then put that data where we actually need it to be. So this is kind of like the next step that we have to do. So if, in terms of does save game exist, if the answer is false, then we don't need to do anything at that particular point, because there is no data to extract from the save game object and put anywhere. So we only really need to do this if we've actually had to load from the slot. So what we can do at this particular point is from the save game data, we can then get these variables here, like so. And that's just going to, and what this is, it's going to be the data specifically that was placed inside the save game object. Now, doing it this way, where we're getting the getting the variables directly, can be a little bit confusing at times, because more often than not, you'll probably end up using similar names or the same names as variables that you have in your various systems. So one way we can kind of make that a little bit clearer is by using a getter functions. So I'm just going to use a single getter function here that's going to essentially return all three of those variables. But if you've got quite a few, you might want to split them up. So this is going to be get dialog data. I'm going to go ahead and add a return node, and we'll drop these in. So these are just the get nodes, and then we'll just drag those onto the output on the return node, and then we do some tidying like so. And because we are just returning the nodes, I'm just going to go ahead and then convert that to a pure node as well. Now if we go back to the dialog base, if we pull from the save data variable, so I'm just pulling from the set pin here, but you can, if you wanted to, drag one in from the variables panel. We can then get the dialog data, and that's just going to give us a single node with all the three variables. So it's a little bit easier to say, okay, yeah, these are all the saved game versions, the saved data versions. Now at this particular point, all we need to do is take the ones actually in the dialog component and set those to the ones that we've just loaded from the save game object. Like so. So at this particular point, we've got to the point now where we can load all that data, and it will apply it to our dialog base when applicable. One thing just to be aware of is just this little section here. So we create the save game object, and we store a reference to that object. But at no point do we actually save it to the disk, which is just one thing to be aware of. So if we create the save game object and we actually run through this again, it will still say that the does save game exist is false, because at no point do we actually ever save the save data variable. If you want it to create and save that to begin with, you can go ahead and do save game to slot, just like that. Just like so. That will be perfectly fine, and that will actually create a file on the disk, which I guess I can quickly show you now because it's going to go ahead and do it. So if I just come in and just play, and I'm just going to close straight out. But if I actually come to the saved folder that I mentioned earlier, you'll notice that there's now a folder at the bottom that I mentioned called Save Games. If we open that up, in there's one called Dialog, and then lastly we have one for Mouse. Now there should technically be one for both of them, so I can only assume that that's because we never set the name on this one, on the blacksmith. So let me double check. Oh no, it's because his name is also Mouse. So let's call this one blacksmith. So now if we quickly run that again, we should have two. Like so. This is probably actually quite a good example of something to make sure that you are careful about. So if you have things that have the same name, that are getting and saving to the same slot name, you could potentially be overwriting. One of them will end up overriding the other. Adding to that, you could also run into issues where one of them could end up getting the wrong data from another one, all depending on load order and things like that. So in this instance, we had two that were both set to mouse, which meant that one of them would have loaded, created that save game object, and then the other one would have been like, oh, there's a file here already, and then load it. So one would have created it and the other one would have then loaded it. So you can see how that can sort of cause some issues. So if you do have issues where things don't seem to be loading properly or saving properly, it is often worth double checking in the save games, just to make sure that the files, well, sort of the file names that you expect are actually in there, because it could indicate that something's named wrong and kind of pointing to the wrong thing. Okay, now another thing that we just want to be aware of as well, particularly when you're dealing with save game stuff, sometimes you may encounter something that looks like a bug, where really what it actually is that you're dealing with old save data. So more often than not, you will find that when working with save game data, you will often need to come into the save game folder and delete everything in it, or bits or certain files, depending on what it is that you're doing. So that way things can go in and refresh. This is kind of one of the advantages as well to splitting out some of your save game objects, because it may mean that you can reset certain sections of your game by resetting those save game objects without getting rid of all the other save game data. Of course, your mileage will most likely vary depending on ultimately how you end up setting them all up and things like that. Okay, so we're getting somewhere. So now we're kind of at the point now where what we actually need to do is take the data that we have in our dialog base and actually set it inside the save game object. Now there's kind of a few ways that we can go about this. So we could do it every time we progress dialog. So we progress dialog all the way to the end. So this example, so whenever we don't pass through, so whenever it's updated, for example, we could do it then. Or alternatively, we can just do it when the conversation's closed. So you can kind of think of it as, you kind of got two options here. I think for me, I would lean more towards doing it on when the conversation's closed. But like as I mentioned, you could do it whenever the player progresses the dialogue. So essentially they've picked a new option. There's pros and cons to both, of course. It depends on how accurate you want it to be. But you just have to remember that if you do have some long dialogue, with lots of different branching options, if something happens to the game, it gets forced closed or something like that, before it gets to closing the conversation, then all that data would be lost. Okay, so kind of what we want to do now, so we come all the way to the end here. Well, this is the closed conversation. So while we're in here, I'm actually going to go in and just sort a few things out here. I'm actually going to go in and add a sequence here. So this is just before the audio component section. If you decide not to do this bit, then that's fine. You can, ignore this. And I'm actually just going to remove these pins here. It's just to make it a little bit clearer as to what's actually happening. So regardless of whether or not this cast succeeds or fails, it should always move on to the next section, and that's the same with this section up here. So using a sequence is just a cleaner way to represent that, really. So yeah, okay, so that's cleaned up a little bit, so it's a little bit obvious as to what's happening. We can probably move that this way a little bit as well. There we go. Right then, so we've got the save dialog data, the load dialog data. Now we need to handle the actual updating of the save data. And you'll probably notice that I didn't say save. We're going to try and reserve that terminology for when we physically save it to disk, it is a clarification that does have to be made, just to prevent confusion. So for this, I'm just going to say update saved data. And what we're going to be doing in here is just updating the data that's inside the save game object. So at this particular point, we're not actually saving it to the disk, we're just updating the data that's in the save game object ready for when we want to save to disk. This will probably make a little bit more sense on the next section. But ultimately, at this particular point, what we need to do is come in and set these that are on the save game object. Again, kind of coming in and doing it directly like this, in all honesty, is a little bit messy and can sometimes be a little bit confusing, again, because you've got variable names that are very similar. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the save game object. I'm going to go ahead and create a new function on here. I'm just going to call this one update dialog data. And this is essentially a setter function that we're creating here. Helps keep things a little bit tidier. These, however, can get a little bit wild if you have quite a lot of variables. Bring those up a little bit. There we go. And then if we come back to the base, we can do the set dialog. Oh, sorry, update dialog data. So from this you can clearly say, okay, so this is the save data, and we're updating all these things on there. So when we update the save data, we can just pull that in like so, and then we just need to connect in the variables directly from the component into the relevant sections. And then lastly, the dialog progress. Like so, and then if we go back to the closed conversation, we can pop in the update save data. I'm just going to do that straight after the conversation closed. Interface events called. So this is at the very end, that's when it's going to attempt to do it. The next thing I'm going to do is actually go ahead and add a variable called autosave. Yep, and I'm just going to add a quick description. Should this component automatically save when data is updated? So if you notice there, obviously I did a little bit of a description. Just because when you say autosave, you can, different interpretations of what's meant there. Obviously it's saving automatically, but obviously to what degree. So in this particular example, what we're going to be using it to represent is whether or not, or whenever this data is updated, whether or not at that particular point we automatically save, or whether or not we're wanting to wait for player input. So we can, in the update save data, we can come in and get a branch for that, like so. Okay, yep. And then lastly, well, I say lastly, it's a safe system, there's loads of things to do. But hopefully, we should be able to get something we can test that's sort of functional. So what we want to do now is go and create a new function. This time I'm going to call it save dialog data. And I'm going to go drop that into the autosave on the true, like so. Now on this save dialog data inside that function, what we need to do is pull in the reference to the save data variable, so that's this one here. Although that has just made me realise there is one thing we want to do in here. So this is the update save data again. We do actually want to convert the save data variable to a validated get, and we only want it to proceed if it's actually valid. Because if there is no save game object, we can't save anything. So there's no point doing whatever comes after. I'm going to go ahead and add an additional. So jumping back to the save dialog data function, we're going to do the same thing with the saved data variable. Again, that's going to be a validated get version. And we want to call the save game to slot. And then we want to connect the get save slot name to the slot name. There is a return value, which is if it was saved to disk successfully, and at this particular point you can do a print string, save successful. So yeah, so I'm just going to use a quick print string here. It might be that you want some message to pop up on the screen, change to a widget or something like that. Completely up to you how it is you want to do that. Then we'll do save failed. So we'll make this one red. It's always good to put print strings around in places from time to time, mainly for the errors, just so you know that something has gone wrong. In a lot of cases it's easier to fix them when you know that they're happening than when you don't know. So putting some saved some messages in can be quite helpful. So I'm also going to go to the load dialog, and we'll just stick one at the end here as well, just for save loaded. And that one as a bluey colour, like so. Okay, so I think at this particular point, assuming autosave is true, which we'll make it true for this example. If we actually go ahead and test, so if I was to come up here, and was talk to mouse, they'll say yes, and then we'll give them some cheese. Yeah, and you notice at the top there it does say save successful. Now if we come back in, the player character will still be in their original spot because we've not saved anything to do with the player character. But if we go back to the dialog, you'll notice that it is now saving essentially. So it's loaded all that data and then reapplied it. So speaking to mouse gives us the same sort of response. Like so. If we go down here, can't remember if he uses different messages or not. No. But yes, so that essentially is the dialog system saving, and again, kind of just to give you a bit more of a context. So when we save to a slot, so that's this thing here, save game slot, that's the thing that physically takes all the data in the save game object and actually saves it to disk. So that's created all these in the dialog folder that we specified. You can technically read some of these, sort of, if you open up a notepad. A lot of it's garbage, but there are some bits you can kind of work out. So there's a few things here. So this one's for the blacksmith. Again, not too much in there, but it is showing that it's on the night for the active dialog branch. So again, sometimes you can kind of come in and work out some of what this means. So it's on the given cheese property. So yeah, that is how to set up saving within the dialog system. Obviously, I am trying to keep this particular episode quite short, although I'm not sure if I've achieved that. I guess I'll find out when I look at the recording time. But just be aware that there is a lot more that you can kind of do in terms of the save system. For example, up here where we update the save data, we have it set to autosave. It might be that you might actually want more of a global autosave system where it's scheduled, so it happens every couple of minutes. So you can implement stuff like that. It might be that instead of an autosave, you want it to only save when the player triggers the save. So again, kind of got lots of things to sort of contend with. Adding to that, you might also have situations that you might want to contend with that involve different levels. So you might have the same character or the same NPC, just in different levels, but you may or may not want to load the previous data from the previous levels. So that is a few things that we've obviously not addressed in this particular video that obviously are things that you may have to think about yourself as you kind of build on what we've done in this episode and turn it into something that's specific to your individual project. So yeah, so I just want to say thank you for watching. Hopefully you found this video useful. I am on Blue Sky, so if you want to see the sort of things that I get up to on a day-to-day basis, by all means pop on there. I'm currently sharing some videos and things to do with one of the current projects that I'm working on, which is a butterfly game where you breed butterflies. So if that sounds like it could be interesting, go check it out. Another thing I just want to state as well, I do have Project Sunrise that's available on the Fab Marketplace. It does include a dialogue system that is based on the general concept of this dialogue system. It is a lot more in depth, includes all this sort of stuff with saving and things like that already built in. So if you want to save yourself some time, go ahead and check that out. So yeah, lastly, I have a Discord, so if you want to have a general chit chat about what you're working on and things like that, by all means drop on there. So yeah, so I just want to say thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.